Tech is one of the hottest industries in the entire world, and compensation figures have always been a little bit shrouded in mystery. That is, of course, until today. Having lived in San Francisco for a few years, I have a bunch of friends who work at the top tech startups and a lot of the FAANG companies, so I've got some research and insight after speaking with a few of them. Just to be clear though, today I'm not going to be talking about compensation figures for roles like product managers or software engineers or data scientists, which are a bit more technical. Today I'm going to be focusing more on business tech roles. So ones that are in things like strategy and operations, growth, product operations, and things like that. So today, I'll first be going straight into tech compensation. I'll then discuss how equity plays a huge role in your compensation, and trust me, you're gonna wanna watch this section because it's pretty important. And lastly, I'll show you some different tech compensation scenarios. Before I begin though, I wanted to give a quick shout out to our sponsor for today's video, Skillful, for helping make this video possible. All right, jumping straight into it, let's go over the numbers for tech compensation. Before I do get started though, I need to provide three very important pieces of context. The first is that the compensation figures I'm about to show you are based on my discussions with friends who live in San Francisco, which is a city with a very high cost of living, and obviously it's also the center of the tech world, and so that's why the compensation figures I'm about to show you are going to be among the highest in the world. Second, please remember that the compensation figures I'm about to show you are much more geared towards those who work in business roles at tech firms, and so things like growth, product operations, strategy and operations, and those kinds of roles. Third and lastly, tech compensation is notorious for being super variable, so please treat my numbers I'm about to show you as a general ballpark as opposed to the law of the land. For example, for the same role of business analyst, you can see here that Facebook, Microsoft, Google, and Amazon all have super different compensation levels and structures. All right, with those caveats stated, let's get started. First, as an overview, the parts of compensation I'll be going over are your salary and bonus, which gets you to your cash compensation, and then your total equity and your annual portion of that equity. To explain the equity, when you first join a tech company, they often provide a 4-year equity grant, which gives you the right to that equity if you work there the full 4 years. So for example, a $100,000 equity grant means that you would earn $25,000 worth of equity every year for 4 years. There is also usually a 1-year cliff, meaning that you don't earn any equity until your first year is fully completed, and this just incentivizes people to stay at least 1 full year, and afterwards your equity vests every quarter. The last important thing I need to mention is that once you stay at a company for 4 years, you typically don't receive another equity grant and instead receive what's called equity refreshers every 1 to 2 years, and this is a smaller amount of equity that incentivizes you to stay at the company. But with that said, the equity refreshers tend not to be as large as the annual amount you would earn from an initial 4-year equity grant, so there's a huge incentive to leave a tech company after 4 years unless you're given a large new equity grant if the company really wants to make you stay because you're a star performer. If this is all confusing, don't worry, we're gonna go through all of this with real life examples in the equity section of this video later. Going back to our table, I'm gonna provide a range of figures through low end, mid-level, and high-end compensation numbers since tech compensation depends on the company and your performance. Starting with our low end, here are the compensation figures, which you can pause to take a closer look at, and I'll also point out a few important things. First off, the most important thing to note is that each of these rows provide compensation figures if you join at that specific level, which I'm pointing out because as I discussed earlier, you don't receive a new equity grant every year. So for example, if you join a tech company as an analyst straight out of college, you receive an initial equity grant here at $20,000, which divided by 4 is $5,000 in equity per year. And if you were to be promoted to associate, you wouldn't receive another $40,000 equity grant. You would still only be entitled to that initial $20,000 in equity, but you'd probably get additional equity in the form of equity refreshers. Another general point is that being promoted in tech every 2 years is considered super fast, and so it's normal to stay at the same position for 3 years at the analyst and associate levels, and 3 to 5 years at the manager and above levels, so keep this in mind as well. Going into the details of these numbers, your salary bumps up at 3% each year when you're within the same title, which is on the low end in tech. You also see a cash bonus that's 10% of your salary until you're a senior manager, where you get 15%, which is on the low end. And lastly, these equity grants are on the low end as well. Now going to our mid-level compensation figures, the main change here, besides just higher numbers across the board, is that your salary bump increases by 4% a year, and your cash bonus increases to 12.5% as an associate, and then 15% as a senior associate onwards. In addition, compared to the low-end compensation numbers, the equity grants here are $20,000 higher for the analyst level, $30,000 higher for the associate level, $50,000 higher for the senior associate level, $80,000 higher for the lead manager level, and $150,000 for the senior manager level. The range of compensation in tech is quite wide, and as you grow more senior at a firm, equity also becomes a much larger part of your compensation, and you're increasingly rewarded for stronger performance. I'll now pause briefly here in case you want to pause the video and look at these numbers in more detail. Finally, going into our higher end of the range of compensation figures, I assume a 5% salary bump when you're within the same title, and then a 15% cash bonus your associate years, and then 20% afterwards, and it's common for tech firms to really want to reward their top performers. Just as before, you also see much higher amounts in the equity grants versus the mid-level compensation figures because the top paying tech firms pay a lot more, especially if you do well at the firm. Again, I'll pause briefly here in case you want to pause the video and look at the numbers in more detail. Now, I know I went through a ton of numbers and it's hard to compare when you just were looking at one chart at a time. So here is a summary for each title with the low end in red, the mid-level in yellow, and the high end in green. Before moving on to the next part of the video, if you are seeing all these tech compensation figures and you're interested in a business career in tech, but you don't know where to start, or maybe you want to enter into a new field, but you don't want to commit all the way before knowing what you're really getting yourself into, I highly recommend checking out Skillful. Skillful is a company that offers 5 to 7 week-long projects, or what they call sprints, in which a mentor who is working at a top tech firm works through a project with you and a small group of peers in sectors like product strategy, strategic finance, growth marketing, and product operations to provide you with hands-on experience. Skillful program graduates have gone on to work at top firms like DoorDash, TikTok, Stripe, Uber, and more, and you're also not just joining a one-time program, but instead a community where previous Skillful graduates help out one another with referrals and recruiting tips. There are limited spots for sprints, but the team at Skillful has told me that in your application, if you write that you were referred by rareliquid, they will prioritize your application. So if you're interested in a business career in tech, check out Skillful down in the description below. Next up, let me show you how equity can make a huge impact on your compensation. Before going into the numbers, just taking a step back, conceptually, if you were to receive a stock for $100 per share and it were to double in 3 years, then you just made a 2x return without really doing much besides holding onto your shares, right? The same thing applies for stock-based compensation at tech companies, and just as how you can invest into a stock or cryptocurrency and it can go up or down, it could be good or bad investment, the same thing applies for compensation for equity at a tech company. What this means is that if you join as an early employee at a company whose stock price just skyrockets like Tesla, then you're probably going to be a millionaire kind of regardless of what role you really have at the company. While if you join a private company whose stock really never amounts to anything, all of that stock-based compensation is pretty much worthless. This is mainly because when you receive your equity packages, whether it's the 4-year initial equity grants or your equity refreshers, the number of shares you're entitled to each year is dependent on the strike or the share price of when you first join that company or get that equity offering. So for example, if you were working at Tesla and you received a $100,000 equity package back in January 2017 when Tesla was trading at around $50 per share, as long as you worked at Tesla for 4 years, you would earn $100,000 divided by $50, which is 2,000 shares, or put another way, 500 shares a year for 4 years. Given that Tesla's share price today is around $1,000, this means that your 2,000 shares would now be worth more than $2 million. Now that you understand how that works, let's run through a more detailed example. Let's say that you work at 3 different tech companies across 10 years, and every year, the company you work at, no matter which one it is, appreciates in stock price by 15% a year, like in this column here. Let's assume your initial equity grant is $45,000, which divided by 4 means that you earn $11,250 in stock compensation per year. That $11,250 divided by the initial share price of $100 means that you earn about 113 shares a year for 4 years, and in your 5th year onward, let's assume that you just hold onto the shares and never sell. As you can see, as the stock price appreciates by 15% a year, the value of your shares increased dramatically, going from $68,439 to $158,304. Now let's add to this and assume that you jump to another new company in year 5 and receive a new equity grant of $120,000. You then receive $30,000 in equity per year, which is $120,000 divided by 4, and this equates to 172 shares per year based on the $175 stock price of when you started at this company. Assuming you stay at that company and never sell, and if shares keep appreciating at 15%, your shares jump in value from $182,505 to $241,363 in just 2 years. Lastly, we'll assume again that you move to a 3rd tech company, and a lot of people do move after every 4 years when all their equity vests. In this scenario, you receive a $350,000 equity grant, which at a share price of $306 equates to 286 shares per year. And if you keep holding them and shares appreciate by 15% a year, that equity becomes more valuable over time. All right, I know I provided a lot of numbers and it might be a little bit hard to understand really how the compensation with your equity affects your overall compensation, but don't worry, at the end of the video, I'll provide a summary of everything. But before that, let's go into equity refreshers, which as a reminder are smaller amounts of equity that are given to employees every 1 to 2 years depending on performance to entice them to stay after their initial equity grant that vests over 4 years fully vests. In our example here, I assume you receive a $35,000 equity refresher at the end of your second year at the first tech company that you work at, and this normally would vest over 4 years, but since you leave the company, you only end up receiving half of the equity refresher, but this is made up for by the new equity grant you receive at your new tech company. Then after you join the second tech company, I assume you receive a $50,000 equity refresher, and similarly, since you leave for your third company, you only receive half of the equity refresher. I assume the share price continues to climb at 15% a year, and so as you accumulate more shares and if you don't sell, the equity increasingly becomes valuable. I kept this section a little bit brief because equity refreshers are really even more variable depending on the company and your performance. So just look at the numbers and in the chart just to kind of see how it all works and how you are incentivized to stay at a company when you receive more equity. That's really the point I was trying to make with that section. All right, now lastly, let me show you some different tech compensation scenarios that combines everything we've been discussing. The first scenario is a sad one where we assume you join a private company and the equity becomes worthless because the company shuts down, and this is really possible and is the risk you take when you join a new, hot, young startup company. This second scenario incorporates everything from the mid-level compensation figures we discussed in today's video. It also assumes you get promoted every 2 years and that you move to a new company every 4 years and that shares at all the companies you join appreciate on average by 15% a year. As you can see from the equity column here, equity increasingly becomes a huge part of your compensation and rises pretty dramatically as you become more senior at the firm. In our third scenario here, the only change in the assumption is that the share price averages an increase of 30% a year, which is obviously not super common and it's pretty rare, but it's possible if you join a company when it's private and the stock price takes off when the company goes public. In this scenario here, you can see that stock compensation overtakes your cash compensation, and this happens fairly often as you become more senior at a tech company. And lastly, here is our super optimistic scenario where we assume you're at the high end level of compensation for your salary, bonus, and equity, and that the stock appreciates by 30% a year. Clearly, this scenario requires a ton of luck and strong performance, and you definitely get rewarded with your compensation as a result. In case you want to compare all 4 scenarios, here they are, and you can pause the video if you'd like to see them in more detail. One other thing I forgot to mention is that with all the compensation figures I showed you today, it doesn't include anything like a signing bonus, relocation bonus, all the different perks that you get for working at a tech company, whether it's really amazing food, health insurance, or any kind of like dental insurance, things like that. There are a ton of perks when you work at a tech company. So even though the compensation figures I showed you today are pretty great, it's not even really the full picture. And that's really the challenge with tech compensation because there's just so much variability and so much extra stuff that they can give you when you work at a tech company. All right, so if you enjoyed this video, please do give it a thumbs up because I put a ton of time and research into the video. And if you'd like to learn more about the tech industry overall, I have a ton of friends who work at the different tech companies in San Francisco, New York, and across the world. So if you'd like to learn anything else, please let me know what you're interested in down in the comments below. Lastly, don't forget to check out Skillful if you're interested in a business career in tech. And with that said, thank you so much as always for watching. Hope to catch you in the next video. Thanks and peace out.